As far as I remember, my first spontaneous thoughts were that it would be a wonderful opportunity to try and bring to the people in New York some idea of the reality of a figure who's become a myth. I think particularly in the United States, where he's not known for his work, he's known for his image as a cult figure. Well, myths are always partly self-made, but myths are what our system of culture thrives on. And until you have a chance to verify a myth, whether it's self-made or media projected, against the reality, which in this case is sculpture, you cannot judge at all whether this is just a product of the media you're talking about. And where Beuys is concerned, the image of the myth has become particularly confusing, partly I think because there's a different attitude towards big cultural figures in Europe. In America, it seems to me, I may be wrong, that a myth can be created on very little knowledge of the totality of what a person is trying to do. On my part, any effort to make a big public exhibition or a publication is always for me an attempt to demythify. What I do try to do in my work is not to damage the complexity of something an artist like Beuys is trying to do, but to put it into language which is accessible. And that's quite difficult. I mean, it's difficult even to install a complex exhibition so that it can be read, but to try and put the concepts and the philosophy that lie behind it into terms that people can understand in a catalogue or a book, I think is even more difficult. With the catalogue, I wanted to use as much as possible of the artist's own words, since with Beuys's work, that seems to be what interests people most of all. His own interpretation of his own motives, above all. For me, a lot of the writing about Beuys, as you know, is extremely complicated and complex and very long words and all this kind of thing. I wanted to see if it was possible to write a simple language text and keep the complexity of the ideas with some clarity. And this is principally an exhibition catalogue. It's an enormous amount of work about a character who's been presented as extremely mystifying. And the intention of the catalogue is certainly not to demystify, but to clarify the things in the work which are very important. If you're dealing with an artist who has tried to merge the life process and the thinking process with the working process, then none of the information is esoteric. It's all equally important. What is wrong, I think, is for writers or critics to join in the esoteric process to make it even more removed from the public. I mean, a semiologist comes usually from a certain ideological background and will use the work as a vehicle to promote his own or her own school of philosophy. In this case, I think it's quite enough to cope with the philosophy and the possible contradictions in the work that's already presented. I think the most important function, and the one which may have the most long-term meaning, is this attempt to demonstrate how far you can push sculpture as a means of communication, not as sculpture itself, but as a vehicle for all these different themes, for everything really, from the normal events of life like birth to attempts to find complex metaphorical, symbolical means of expressing political theory. Once you've expressed very clearly, as he has, that the essence of life and the essence of the perception of the energy of life lies in our contact with the material world, that's a clear enough way of saying that any material is potentially an artistic carrier of meaning. I would take the question the other way around and say, why is there any material which is not considered suitable? Well, if you start from the standpoint that life is the process of art and art is the process of life, and that what is lacking in modern life is a sense of the wholeness, the relationship between the way we live physically, the way we think, the way we feel, and you ask yourself, how can all these things be brought together so that we don't exist simply as materialist beings and we don't exist simply as ineffective spiritual freakouts or dropouts. Where Beuys is concerned, the basic philosophy is that bringing those two together means being a better materialist. If you accept the idea that everyone is an artist, and that by the most important function of living is the way we organize things, physical things to begin with. I mean, our first activity as human beings is to organize our environment in a personal way and then in a social way. That means what must have been lost is the intensity of feeling for this physical environment, i.e. materials. What's also been lost is the motivation to do more than personal things with this material, the material we live with. And when you talk about the energy of materials, I take it as meaning that you associate the personal response engendered by material with the will to organize material in life, and therefore with the will to organize on a bigger social plane, and to reject the purely personal. Approach from Tom Messer was made in 1976 at a very good time for thinking about organising this kind of thing. From Beuys's own point of view, it seemed to be the right time. As you know, before, he'd turned down offers from American museums here in New York.
Do you know what? Can you tell us why?
Well, that was the specific reason was because it was still during the Nixon era, Vietnam War and things like that. The other reason was that the way Messer approached the idea was a very open way, unusually open for a museum. Really a carte blanche to Beuys to set up his own exhibition and select his own works and do it as he pleased. The museums were very full with their exhibitions, acquisitions. The private collections consist of an enormous amount of pop art, minimal art, American conceptual art. While in a way, it's a form of hospitality towards American artists, it was very glaringly obvious that it was not reciprocal. I don't know how many living European artists you can think of who've had big exhibitions in America or who are well represented in American museums.
While they're alive, particularly.
While they're alive, yes. And this is obviously not correct, and from the European perspective it does look like a very heavy example of a certain form of American cultural domination. And Beuys is recognisably one of Europe's major artists, and in a way this is a European product. And the tradition of European art to which Beuys does belong, that's his sources and his development come out of the European tradition, has much more to do with meaning, which is why I think it's possible for him to extend this meaning into life, social work, political work. Yes, again, if one really genuinely accepts the idea that everyone is an artist and that it's the restrictions put on the term artist which are damaging, then obviously everything is social sculpture. The Free University by its nature has to be the contributions of many people. Beuys brings to it his own very powerful energy, his own very deep understanding of the processes of life and how they affect negative political situations and how they could produce an alternative. I think the notoriety stemming from a highly controversial and obviously very effective way of teaching in an institution like an academy in Germany. I mean, you have to remember what that means. That usually means a master, the teacher, and a situation similar to apprentices. It's an extremely traditional system. which he bust open by admitting hundreds of students. And the things the media often concentrates on, like his manner of dress and the way he makes maximum use of the artist's license as being unaccountable to anyone else. I think he uses all these things very, very deliberately and very skillfully.